It is such a pleasure to introduce Ruy, who is a professor at the University of Sao Paulo in sociology and the director of the Center for Citizenship Rights, which was great because I couldn't figure out how to summarize Ruy's incredible publication record, but it's about the history, the changing history of citizenship rights in a way, because his early work was on the destruction of Fordism in Brazil, and then the rise of the precariat, and then a series of, and rebel cities, and a series of other books looking at changing over time, the changing character of labor relations, labor experiences, and public sociology in Brazil. I should also say that I've known Ruy for several years, mostly from conferences, but he also contributed to the book that was published in 2024, Engaging Erica Olenwright, in which he describes some of his public sociology work, which I think he's written about a little bit less than the precariat. But it's a really, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a really interesting description of the Emancipation Project as sort of a popular education program in Sao Paulo and other Brazilian cities, and is exactly the kind of public sociology that Michael Buravoy always, it's part of why Ruy and Michael were such good friends, as well as Ruy and Eric. So, yeah. So it is a real pleasure to introduce you to a room that both Michael and Eric absolutely loved. Yeah.
Oh gosh, it is a huge pleasure to be here, and to this opportunity. Thank you, Right Ribbon Center for Social Justice, for this opportunity. I'm really, I cannot express how thankful I am to be here, and Adrian, and to see all those very, very friendly and nice faces. Fatinha, Jana, Alex, Gay, oh goodness. So, I'm totally delighted. I'm totally, thankful for this opportunity. So, unfortunately, I have to read my presentation. Otherwise, I wouldn't manage the time appropriately. So it's like, I know that is really boring. But on the other hand, it's the only way that I found in order to, basically fit my presentation in 15 minutes. So I'm gonna start reading, and if my pace is too intense, basically say, slow down. I'm gonna do it. Between December 2007 and June 2009, when the Great Recession swept through much of the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, and Russia, ushering in an era marked by government bailouts for banks and social spending cuts for workers, few could have imagined that the first half of 2010s would be dominated by a global wave of protests led by young workers, mostly racialized and underemployed. In 2011, a nationwide movement of resistance against austerity measures adopted by U.S. state governments, the Occupy movement, was followed by a massive protest against policy harassment of Black communities across the country. That same year, the Arab Spring spread through North Africa, toppling dictatorships and threatening autocratic monarchies. Soon after, young people, mostly underemployed, took the streets and occupied squares in Spain and Portugal. Through these mobilizations, they revitalized left-wing parties and trade unions, achieving significant electoral victories and defeating austerity policies. In Brazil, the June 2013 protests challenged the governments of varying ideological orientations, making the first popular victory since the country's redemocratization cycle in the 80s. By the mid-2010s, the Black Lives Matter platform organized the first successful nationwide wave of mobilizations in the United States, following the uprising in Ferguson after murder of the young Black man, Michael Brown, by a white police officer. At the same time, a powerful reaction to these protests began to take shape, giving rise to what some scholars have called a third wave of autocratization. From that point on, authoritarian nationalist leaders began to threaten liberal democratic institutions, attacking civil liberties, repressing dissent, plotting coups, and reforming constitutions to preserve and expand their arbitrary power. Evidently, the principal leader of this new wave of autocratization is Donald Trump. Over the course of his second term, the President of the United States has systematically devoted himself to dismantling public services aimed at the working class, especially those that serve the most impoverished and racialized segments of the population. In addition, he has intensified policies of persecution and deportation of immigrants, which have already affected around 400,000 people, more or less, whose central effect has been the spread of fear and insecurity across thousands of communities, particularly Latino ones, throughout the country. At the same time, his foreign policy has taken on an overtly imperialist orientation aimed at expanding control over strategic reserves of oil and minerals, as evidenced by the recent attack on Venezuela and threats to annex Greenland. This is thus a moment in which the political violence exercised by the leading state in the international system is consciously directed toward two interconnected objectives: the expropriation of external wealth for the benefit of enhancing the profitability of investment by major U.S. corporations, and the reduction of the costs of reproduction, the domestic working class. Schematically, one might say that the crisis of neoliberal globalization has given rise to a new global interregnum, a historical period in which, to recall Antonio Gramsci, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. In this context, social activists increasingly came to perceive that the most devastating effects of the crisis of neoliberal globalization fell above all upon racialized workers. The pandemic and the current climate crisis have only reinforced this understanding. In 2020, during the largest and most widespread cycle of protests in United States history, in reaction to the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis, countless demonstrators carrying signs in bold in Malcolm X's famous statement, "You can have capitalism without racism." The globalization of BLM movement in 2021 helped to spread the idea worldwide, reviving from the past once peripheral expression, racial capitalism. The popularization of this phrase reflects a growing recognition that capitalist crises deepen not only class and gender oppression, but also racial oppression. Moreover, the open and racist and xenophobic policies adopted by authoritarian governments in response to the crisis only confirm that conclusion. Broadly speaking, this is a historical context in which debate over the meaning of racial capitalism flourished. Since mid-2010s, criticisms of this supposed theory, which in reality doesn't present itself in a unified form, have multiplied. Among the most influential objections, four main critical orientations can be identified. First, some authors argue that the notion of racial capitalism lacks heuristic power due to its limited capacity of generalization. They claim, for instance, that ethnically and racially homogeneous capitalist societies exist, such as Japan, which would undermine the concept's universal explanatory ambition. A second critique targets the centrality given to the U.S. experience. From this perspective, the literature on racial capitalism is overly concentrated on the American example to the treatment of other historical and geographical formations. Third critique concerns the primacy attributed to the category of race, often at the expense of other dimensions of social oppression, such as gender and sexuality. Finally, the fourth and surely most demanding critical orientation concerns the under-theorization of the logical relationship between capitalist accumulation and racial oppression. In Racial Domination, for example, the sociologist Ruy Braga advances a forceful critique of the notion of racial capitalism, arguing that it is a category that tends to homogenize distinct historical experiences, lapses into a diffuse economicism, and conflates analytically different logics, particularly those of economy and politics. For Braga, theorists of racial capitalism fail to establish a theoretically convincing relationship between capital accumulation and racial oppression. In this sense, the connection between capitalism and racism functions less as a rigorous analytical tool than as a critical normative slogan. In some, such authors transform a historically contingent association between capitalism and racial domination into a theoretical necessity without demonstrating at the conceptual level that capitalist accumulation structurally depends on racial oppression. I highlight this critique because I believe the French sociologists correctly identified the central challenge in facing a theory of racial capitalism. Without dismissing the relevance of the other objections mentioned above, it seems to us that Bacan is particularly successful in demanding greater conceptual clarity and epistemological responsibility from the debate. More than that, he precisely formulated the core of the problem by requiring proponents of racial capitalism to demonstrate the necessary nexus between capital accumulation and racial oppression, without which the very expression racial capitalism would be empty of its heuristic capacity. The focus of my presentation is precisely to argue that, yes, on the basis of the tradition of Black Marxism, it is possible to provide a theoretical grounding for the existence of a necessary relationship between capitalism and racism. In order to explore the historical and relational nature of this selective affinity, I will begin with the leading contemporary exponent of critical social theory, Nancy Fraser. It has failed to Nancy Fraser to offer the most compelling, in my opinion, obviously, the most compelling and innovative answer to the question concerning the nature of that relationship. For her, thinking through the relation between racism and capitalism requires starting from the articulation between economic exploitation and political expropriation, which together sustain the drive for capital accumulation. In accumulation based on expropriation, capital dispenses with the contractual relation of purchasing labor power, focusing instead on the more or less violent dispossession of goods and resources, whether through enslavement, the indebtedness of working class families, or the appropriation of material and human resources. Fraser observes that's it. The expropriated subjects may end up as exploited proletarians, if they are lucky, or if not, as paupers, slum dwellers, sharecroppers, natives, or slaves, subject to ongoing expropriation outside the wage nexus. Thus, Fraser suggests that economic exploitation and political expropriation presuppose different legal statuses, separating social groups endowed with rights from subordinate and unfreed peoples. Some groups circulate within the domain of formal equality and citizenship, while others are subject to arbitrariness, inequality, and consequently racial oppression. In this logic, each regime of accumulation produces its own political status, from which it extracts surplus value. Capitalist accumulation, therefore, concretely articulates the contractual equality of wage workers, subject to economic exploitation, with the political expropriation of groups, peoples, and territories carried out by the state. Sorry. Despite its merits, this formulation presents a certain ambiguity for those seeking to analytically justify the structurally racist character of capitalism. The ambiguity stems from the fact that, for Fraser, groups are peoples subject to political expropriation, the core of racialization, are outside the wage nexus, Consequently, they would also stand at the margins of capitalist accumulation based on economic exploitation. Following this logic, we would be led to infer that exploited workers are almost limited to the relatively small white working classes of advanced capitalist countries, while expropriated workers would encompass an incalculable mass of wretched of earth spread across the globe. However, in our view, the key to understanding the relationship between economic exploitation and political expropriation lies not into the theoretical opposition between these poles, but in their contradictory unity. In his analysis of wage, Marx had already demonstrated that regardless of the unrealistic assumption that the value of labor power is fully paid by the capitalist, factors such as competition among workers, layoffs, economic crisis, the fluctuations in commodity demand, in commodity demand, force workers to sell their labor power below its value. Both the subversion of contractual equality and the repression of strikes, protests, and trade unions are forms of political violence in the service of economic exploitation. In short, Marx would not support the opposition suggested by Fraser between economic exploitation and understood as an equivalent value paid to the worker in the form of wage, and political expropriation conceived as the incorporation of goods and resources without an exchange of equivalents through political violence. This is because both are already part of the reproduction of wage relation in a society where competition among workers and the monopoly of hiring and firing power by capitalists structure the dynamics of wage labor. For Fraser, economic exploitation and political expropriation are analytically distinct forms of capitalizing surplus value. In our opinion, this separation is mistaken, since they are dialectically united. Indeed, capitalist expropriation requires a transformation of political violence into an instrument of capital accumulation. It is a necessary social condition for economic exploitation, but in itself doesn't generate surplus value. At most, political expropriation can provide labor, goods, and natural resources at prices below their value. Even so, the capitalization of surplus value, that is, the expanded reproduction of capital, continues to depend on the use of these goods and resources by wage laborers. Political expropriation may reduce the costs of capitalist investment, but it doesn't directly expand the invested value. It merely increases the capitalist's profitability. The theft of land in the colonies, for example, is a brutal act of violence that, by itself, doesn't generate capital accumulation. Only when the land is capitalized, that is, transformed into an object of economic exploitation, does it become part of the process of value valorization. Even when stolen land is converted into a commodity, guaranteeing profitability to capitalist investment, its low price merely anticipated its future capacity to generate profits through the exploitation of the workers employed on it. In other words, at some point, political expropriation must be transformed into economic exploitation in order to produce surplus value. This transformation, central to the expanded reproduction of capital, loses analytical precision when economic exploitation and political expropriation are treated as separated spheres and assigned to distinct groups of workers. Empirically, it is actually far more common for exploit and expropriated workers to coexist within the same families and communities, both in the global north and south. Although political expropriation more frequently affects racialized workers, white workers are also impacted by this process. Naturally, it is easy to agree with Fraser that political expropriation drives new extractivist activities in countries of the global south. However, it is the exploitation of the labor of racialized and precarious groups, those she classifies as expropriated, that actually valorize capital. Likewise, she's right to criticize the plundering of working-class families' economy through usurious indebtedness. Yet, bank debt doesn't constitute an autonomous regime of accumulation. In reality, the value of the interest paid by indebted workers derives from their own labor activities. In the end, the argument fails to establish a necessary structural relationship between capitalism and racism, approaching, albeit reluctantly, a contingent interpretation. For Fraser, in contrast to the racialized regimes of accumulation of the past, the novelty lies in the fact that by universalizing precarity, I'm quoting her, by universalizing precarity, financialized capitalism exploits and expropriates nearly everyone at once. Nevertheless, racial oppression remains alive. Logically, the challenge is to understand why racism persists as a central issue in a contemporary society. Fraser's response advances in two directions. On one hand, she argues that by universalizing precarity and eliminating the barrier between economic exploitation and political expropriation, financialized capitalism has, I'm quoting, objectively weakened the foundation of racism. On the other hand, she suggests that due to the paranoia, I'm quoting, and desperate scramble for safety generated by near-universal expropriation, racism is fueling right-wing authoritarian populisms in different national contexts. The reason, however, is unconvincing on its own terms. If financialized capitalism objectively weakens racism, how can one simultaneously defend the thesis of the structural and historical entwinment between capitalism and racial oppression? After all, does capitalism reproduce racism, or does it favor, I'm quoting, a structural opening toward a post-racial society? Does the persistence, there is something weird in this stuff, but anyway, it's a matter of another technical issue. But does the persistence of racism today rest solely on the irrational feelings of a white working class threatened by the universalization of precarity? If that is the case, what is the materialist foundation of Fraser's theory? Contrary to Fraser's suggestion, the universalization of precarity did not result from the replacement of economic exploitation by political expropriation as the basis of capital accumulation. As became clear during COVID-19 pandemic, the generalized deterioration of working class living conditions, both in global north and south, increase competition among workers, deepening the inequalities inherent in the technical, social, and international divisions of labor. The result was the reinforcement of the unequal distribution of workers along the various color lines. In sum, economic exploitation and political expropriation are far more difficult to separate than Fraser assumes. Even if in a modified form, the confusion between the concepts of economic exploitation and political expropriation also appears in Cedric Robinson's critique of Marx's general law of accumulation. For the author of Black Marxism generally identifies the main proponent of the thesis of necessary intertwining between racism and capitalism by treating both the working and the capitalist classes as homogeneous. Marxism would be incapable of understanding the reproduction of capital and gender divisions in modernity. This perspective, also shared by post-colonial and decolonial authors, rests on the idea that Marx's theory of value homogenizes the subaltern classes due to the centrality of the concept of abstract labor. This is generally the main reason cited by such critics to claim Marxism's supposed inability to connect the capital accumulation to racial oppression. It would thus represent a kind of original sin of Marxist theory. Without recognize the ethnic, national, cultural, and racial differentiation among social agents, how could one account for the racial hierarchies inherent from the past that shape modern social structures? At this point, inspired by the South African Black Marxist tradition, whose principal intellectual leader was Neville Alexander, it is worth revisiting some foundations of Marx's theory of value and asking whether there is room for social differentiation within his critique of political economy. Indeed, considering the reference of slave labor and capital appear in the transition from theoretical abstract sections to historical ones, that is in chapter 5, devoted to labor process, it might seem legitimate, as Cedric Robinson and post-colonial and decolonial authors do, to assume that for Marx, the question of racial oppression belongs to the history of capitalism's development and does not fit within his theory of value. From this standpoint, Marxism would be inadequate to grasp the relationship between economic accumulation and racial hierarchies, because it would have excluded them from the core of its theory in favor of a supposedly homogeneous concept, abstract labor, as the measure of value. Incapable of apprehending the social production of the difference expressed in race, nationalities, and genders, Marxism would fail to capture the general relationship between capital accumulation and the political expropriation of racialized peoples, regardless of Marx's repeated emphasis in his historical readings on the role of reproducing racial or ethnic divisions within working class as a capitalist weapon against workers' movements. But after all, does the concept of abstract labor disqualify a Marxist analysis of ethnic, national, and racial diversity? In my opinion, definitely not. Contrary to what Robinson and many post-colonial and decolonial critics suggest, Marx's concept of abstract labor is intrinsically linked to the ethnic and racial divisions present in society. This is because abstract labor constitutes a conceptual expansion that presupposes the totality of concrete labors, including racialized ones, that participate in commodity production. At this level of abstraction, use values are considered solely as values, that is, as crystals of this social substance. This social substance corresponds to the expenditure of human labor, I'm quoting Marx, of human labor power, irrespective of the form of that expenditure. These things represent only the fact that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor has been accumulated in them. Marx then argues that abstract labor gives the commodity its value. The use value of the commodity has value only because of the abstract labor embodied in it. The magnitude of this value is determined by the quantity of abstract labor measured in time that entered its production. Marx, however, makes an important qualification, a decisive one. Labor time must be expended in a socially necessary manner. As he writes, socially necessary labor time is the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society. It is only the amount of socially necessary labor or the labor time socially necessary for its production that determines the magnitude of a commodity's value. Okay. I think it's okay. Socially necessary labor mediates between abstract labor, which creates value, and concrete labor, which produces use values. I think that's it. It is therefore worth noting that the abstract dimension of labor doesn't free it from its concrete form, since for a commodity to have value, labor must be expended in its socially necessary form. In short, it is impossible to separate concrete labor from abstract labor except through theory. Conceptually speaking, capitalist accumulation and competition are a process that allow the exchange of products of concrete labor as equivalents, even though they are fundamentally different. In other words, the value form arises only when the social purpose of production is the creation of surplus value. In capitalism, this alien force dominates the labor process. Instead of satisfying social needs, producing useful things, and imparting a human form to the products of labor, labor must generate surplus value. For the first time in history, labor ceases to be merely concrete and becomes also abstract. Marx insisted that capitalists do not produce commodities for the sake of their use value, but as a means of producing surplus value. Therefore, individual capitalist production must always be organized to maximize the profitability of invested capital. This compels the capitalist to employ labor that is skilled or more skilled than that used by competitors. If the capitalist fails to do so, they will be punished by consumers who will buy from competitors whose commodities are sold at lower prices. Driven by competition, capitalists employ socially necessary labor to produce surplus value. This type of labor, which represents the concrete manifestation of abstract labor, is specifically capitalist because only under this mode of production have the market and division of labor expanded globally, forcing direct producers to relate to one another through a common measure, the magnitude of socially necessary labor times contained in each commodity. In short, abstract labor arises from the essential features of capitalism. Here, it is important to recall that the adjective abstract refers not to a supposed homogenizing tendency of concrete labor under capitalism, as the critique assumes, but to the universalization of socially necessary labor as a means of producing surplus value. Or, to recall Alfred Zona-Bertel, the abstraction of the value form is not located at the level of knowledge, but at that of the effective social practices engendered by the universalization of commodity exchange. It is a real abstraction, produced in the very social operation of exchange and independent of the agent's consciousness. Yet, as E.P. Thompson would insist, this abstraction, which he would instead describe as a structure, doesn't impose itself upon a homogeneous social terrain. Rather, it is historically realized through concrete processes of formation, division, and discipline of the working class. Thus, although at the formal level of the value form labor appears undifferentiated and interchangeable, the erasure of this concrete determinations is poorly formal. Contrary to Lamarck's Wood's claim that under capitalism, hierarchies linked to the civic status are not constitutive of class relations, and that racism and capitalism therefore operated as separate and unequal source of social power, we argue that the racial oppression exceeds an ideological mechanism for dividing workers. Modern racial oppression stems from the reproduction of the real abstraction, an articulated set of effective social practice intimately linked to the valorization of value. Racism is therefore not primarily a matter of attitudes, beliefs, or supremacist doctrines, but an alienated material force operating behind individual consciousness on that may give rise to ideologies while remaining essentially independent of them. It is precisely through this material logic that in concrete historical experience, distinct groups of workers are systematically classified, hierarchized,
Made hierarchical.
Yeah. And confined to positions of intensified exploitation, precarity, and political unprotection. In this sense, the alienation that appears as the racialization of labor can be understood simultaneously as a material condition of real abstraction and as the sedimented outcome of struggles, defeats, and historical impositions inscribed in ongoing construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of collective class identities. Far from contradicting the abstract logic of value form, racial capitalism constitutes one of its historical conditions of reproduction, leading racialized workers to experience the abstraction of value as a permanent process of political expropriation. That said, how should we relate socially necessary labor to the social hierarchies and ethnic and or racial difference inherited from the past. First of all, it is crucial to understand that capitalism absorbs labor, the means of production, and the knowledge necessary for the production of surplus value in their historically determined forms. The creation of the social factors of production is based on the historical conditions of human existence. Thus, it is inevitable that capitalism instrumentalized ethnic hierarchies and racial classifications inherited from the past, adapting them to the goal of producing surplus value. Contrary to what post-colonial and or decolonial critics think, the cultural diversity of the subaltern social groups that make up the working class is not an obstacle to capital accumulation. In practice, capitalists usually find concrete labor concentrated in occupational specializations rooted in particular communities of laborers. In these specializations become socially necessary, if these specializations become socially necessary for the production of a specific commodity, community identities will be used by capitalists to reduce costs and increase profits. Thus, constrained by the socially necessary form of labor, the capitalist resorts to ethnic, racial, and gender differences as means to achieve greater profitability. If necessary, the capitalists may even invent ethnic fictions to facilitate the valorization of value, simply claiming, for example, Irish are more disciplined than blacks. The competition this arbitrary statement generates between the two groups is enough to intensify the pace of work. The foundation of such fictions rests on the belief that distinct ethnic groups present differential costs of social reproduction as well as unequal levels of discipline, skill, intelligence, motivation, and productivity. By inventing these fictions, capitalists select the groups deemed more reliable or efficient for certain tasks, organize the capitalist hierarchy in the workplace, and fragmenting solidarity among workers. Thus, community, ethnic, and racial differences are instrumentalized to increase the surplus labor time freely provided by the workforce to the capitalists. Through this process, the average social conditions of labor utilization change, and other capitalists must adopt the same practice. In this sense, the production and reproduction of social classifications based on community, ethnic, or racial difference are inherent to the dynamics of capital accumulation. This is why capitalists cannot rely on specific worker qualifications for long. They must preserve their sacrosanct right to manage the labor process as the average social conditions of labor utilization evolve. Logically, capitalists must discipline their labor force, making it adaptable to the changes imposed by business competition. In this context, community difference play a crucial role. Returning to the previous example, if Irish workers at a given moment prove more adaptable to extra work intensity, over time, they tend to establish a rhythm they regard as normal, resistant further intensification. To confront this challenge, capitalists threaten to replace Irish with black workers. Clearly, it is not black workers who threaten the Irish, but rather the commodification of labor, which forces them to offer their labor power at a faster pace or a lower price. In this example, community and or national identities become social markers capable of identifying a potentially more exploitable labor force. To make workers accept the prevailing rate of exploitation, capitalists pit one group against another, using their autocratic power to hire and fire. Thus, inherent or newly produced social differences, such as ethnic, national, or racial hierarchies, define what is socially necessary for extracting workers' abstract labor time. Finally, intercapitalist competition and capital accumulation lead to increased mechanization of production, creating greater heterogeneity within and among firms due to the development of the technical division of labor. The new division of tasks generally renders part of the labor force redundant for capital. Marx called this fraction of the working class the relative surplus population, attributing to it the potential to regulate wage according to the average rate of profit. Composed of latent, floating, intermittent, and marginalized groups of workers, the relative surplus population deepens the diversity that exists within the working class. It is worth recalling that these groups do not result from the persistence of anachronistic methods of labor, but rather from the investment in modern equipment. Workers are forced to move from one sector to another according to the needs of the capitalists. During periods of expanding demand, they are drawn by the higher rates offered in industry. During periods of contraction, they are expelled toward unemployment and underemployment. The power to expand or contract the relative surplus population is a privilege of the capitalists, who decides when to hire and when to fire. In turn, workers who fall into the relative surplus population experience different levels of precarity determined by the nature of their new occupations and the level of their earnings. Over time, these workers are compelled to reproduce themselves under subnormal conditions, causing the value of their labor power to fall below the value of subsistence. These differentiations by no means unrelated to communal and racial identities, since precarious occupations are generally filled by immigrant and racialized workers, that is, by those who have little choice but to accept the worst jobs in the labor market. And these workers do not remain apathetic in the face of the effects of wage slavery. Even before forming trade unions, their first impulse is to strengthen the communities where their families live. Generally, these communities remain united due to the presence of a system of practical solidarities nurtured by kinship, ethnicity, race, and gender, which constitute an important source of support in the face of uncertainties produced by the commodification of labor. It should be emphasized that these ties also help workers regain some control over the labor market through the regulation of job competition. By mediating access to available positions through friends or relatives, ethnic and racial communities end up informally monopolizing control over employment opportunities, selecting the individuals deemed fit to work. This tacit regulation favors non-class associative forms such as churches and families, which deepens divisions within the working class. Eventually, these divisions stimulated the bottom-up process of racialization, potentially mobilizing workers against one another in racist terms. This is a consequence of the commodification of labor that sustains the top-down racialization of the relative surplus population. After all, workers are not only producers with collective interests, but also individual sellers of their labor power, competing with one another for the same opportunities in the market. In short, the existence of abstract labor doesn't produce homogenization, but differentiation among workers. As capital accumulation expands from Europe to other continents, the development of colonialism, enslavement, and imperialist oppression reinvent inherited ethnic classifications, dehumanizing and naturalizing them, while simultaneously relegating certain groups of workers to substandard occupations. This naturalization of ethnic difference eventually created supposedly immutable social markers, race, that subordinated certain social groups based on a reified notion of superiority, initially biological and after the Second World War, cultural. In his magnum opus, Marx interpreted the history of development of modern society as the combination of the expropriation of European peasants and artisans with the enslavement of African, Asian, and indigenous peoples of the Americas. To speak of racial capitalism means first and foremost to recover the standpoint of primitive accumulation in order to critique the fiction of equality and freedom that still today sustains the capitalist narrative of individual merit. It is to affirm that the history of capitalism is the history of the violent expropriation of peoples systematically expelled from the world of equality and freedom. This violent expropriation constitutes the historical manifestation of the universalization of capitalist relations of production. It is not their cause. Consequently, the racialization of workers and their communities arise from the inherent combination within capital accumulation between the dehumanization of labor and the instrumentalization of existing social difference among workers by capitalists eager to absorb socially necessary labor time into their means of production and to produce marketable commodities. From this standpoint, race are social construction that derive from the uneven and combined development of capitalism on a world scale. At the same time, since the overwhelming majority of direct producers are non-white peoples, the expanded reproduction of capital finds virtually unlimited possibilities to instrumentalize cultural differences, transforming them into racial antagonisms in order to divide workers and subject them to economic relations of exploitation regulated by the socially necessary labor time required for the production of a given commodity. The condition for this to occur is the systematic activation of political expropriation of workers who must be separated from their means of production, especially from fertile lands. To this end, capitalism relies on an indispensable ally, the capitalist state. Through imperialist policies, the capitalist state supports the accumulation regime controlled by national bourgeoisies, ensuring through extra economic violence that working class communities across the world submit to the commodification of labor. At the same time, the state guarantees that capitalists enjoy privileged access to the sources of material wealth necessary for the expanded reproduction of capital. The political violence inherent in the subjugation of workers and territories thus becomes a powerful economic force, protecting and rendering profitable capitalist investments. In this way, political expropriation becomes the very condition of economic exploitation. Supported by the state, capitalists resort to the racialization of workers to enhance their investments. In turn, the wide historical variety of forms through which racial oppression dividing workers has been instrumentalized is determined by the dynamic of social struggles, which either reinforce or mitigated color barriers. If Stuart Hall is correct in asserting that race is the modality in which classes live, then racism is the grammar that articulates the experience of workers and capitalists in a society caught between political expropriation and economic exploitation. The reproduction of capitalism constantly transformed workers' collective identities, preventing their consolidation into a coherent political subject. Hall suggests that overcoming this barrier presupposes a hegemonic project grounded in a non-substantialist analysis of class, hence the strategic nature of the relationship between race and class. In my most recent book, Racial Capitalism, an Introduction, I sought to articulate a strategic and non-substantialist analysis of the relation between race and class through the exposition of three Black Marxists whose approaches complement one another: Harold Wolff, Clovis Moura, and W.E.B. Du Bois. This complementarity derives in part from the importance of the national cases they investigated, South Africa, Brazil, and the United States, in the uneven and combined development of the relationship between capitalism and racism. Yet, it is their theoretical and methodological lessons for updating the theory of racial capitalism that matter most. In the book, I examine how the transition to industrial capitalism in South Africa produced a racialized regime of accumulation based on the reproduction regulated by the capitalist state of the social conditions for cheap labor. I then highlight how colonial slavery in Brazil fostered a relentless class struggle between masters and enslaved, culminating in the formation of a labor market that perpetuated the substantive inequality between whites and blacks, even as racial oppression was masked by ideologies of racial democracy and mestiçagem. By examining the division between white and black workers in the formation of industrial capitalism in the United States and its role in blocking an authentic labor movement and enabling the capitalist counter-revolution after the Civil War, I argue that the trajectories of South Africa, Brazil, and the United States expose the contradictory dynamics of racial capitalism. Capital produces racialized labor relations that generate class struggle whose outcome depends on workers' ability to forge political identities beyond race. From a comparative and internationalist perspective, understanding the articulation between economic accumulation and racial oppression is thus essential to illuminate the histories of resistance and to imagining emancipatory futures and an authentic unity of the working class in the global North and South. Or, as Frantz Fanon wrote, it is at the heart of national consciousness that international consciousness is raised and unleavened. And this double emergence is ultimately the kernel of all culture. Thanks.
I mean, if I could just get us started, in thinking about the implications a little bit more for class formation, and what this way of looking at and approaching political expropriation with economic exploitation, how do we then understand processes of class formation for example, in contemporary Brazil, to give more more precision to it? And something that I've been, you mentioned also the sort of formation of these kinship ties, right? That are the basis for solidarity and can also, in some cases, generate disclosure, right? And I've been thinking a lot about ways that it can go in the other way and generate, broader class-wide solidarity. What that would look like and what that would take. So I'm curious about that. Your take on that from the Brazilian experience as well.
Sure. I should respond and then we open another. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you guys for following me in this long reading experience. And thank you, Jonah, for the question about the class formation. I would say that probably would be more accurate to talk about not exactly class formation, but class transformation, or I would say the remaking of classes in terms of experience and identity and collective identities and stuff. Because when you take a look on Brazil right now, we're going to see the old experiences. I mean, the old identities, like the old Fordist working class, etc., is being smashed by the neoliberal wave, changes in political, agendas. Even the traditional working class parties are changing a lot, or changed a lot for the last 20, 30 years. So the regime of accumulation, mode of development, I mean, we faced in Brazil, like in America or other countries, the deindustrialization process, which means that the old working class was smashed, and in replace of this old working class, we got new experience, because the conflict is the base of the transformation of class. I mean, the conflict is over there. The conflict is still there, despite the fact that the experience, the historical experience, are changing, are transforming the practice of the agents, etc. So I would say that we are facing in Brazil this very interesting phenomena that the old experience are being transformed in new ones, and we have to identify which are the most important trends within this process. And in my opinion, one of the most important experiences which are, occurring right now in Brazil, is the fact that the Brazilian working class, historically racialized, but which experience is being developed within a society which really talk about races, is changing. So the Brazilian working class never see themselves as racialized working class. They see themselves as a national working class, like, white working class. But in practical terms, they are not. They are racialized. They are being subject to racial oppression all the time, etc. The liberal market is terrible to those guys. So, to those guys, the groups of racialized workers. So right now it's changing. Since 2010, 2012, and unions didn't identify it yet, this changing as a very important issue. The political parties are trying to understand what's going on right now, but in a very fragmented way. So we have to understand that the formation, or I would say the transformation of the collective identities is current right now is a normal process. It's part of the history of the class struggles, etc. But we have to be able to identify the main trends within this process. And in my opinion, the race oppression will play a crucial role in this remaking of the Brazilian working class experience in the next. The idea of racial justice is getting more and more important in Brazil right now. The project which will succeed, politically speaking, is more connected to this agenda. So the youth, mainly the youth, because there is this, it is weird. We can talk a lot about it because I got some experience as a militant of a social movement in popular education. The families and the youth, they are fighting each other in a very, very, clear way. So the youth are able to see themselves as, for instance, Black people. But the old guys are very skeptical about this. So, we can talk about this, but I would say that the racial oppression is going to play a crucial role in the transformation of the collective identities in Brazilian working class now.
Okay, I've got a question. So
what is your name?
I'm Justin. I'm a third year PhD student here in sociology, and I guess we've heard you talk a lot about, and often here in Marxist analyses, a big focus, especially on working class cohesion, working class reproduction. I guess I would like to hear your thoughts on what this framework has to offer on the flip side: capitalist cohesion, capitalist domination, the maintenance of that structure, and who has access to these regimes of accumulation, whiteness, the relationship between whiteness and, I guess, middle and professional class status, and the access to the potential to become a capitalist, and the structures which maintain cultural and political cohesion amongst the capitalist class.
It's a very, very challenging question, because I'm not a researcher on middle classes or professional classes, etc. But obviously, the class relation or the class exploitation is tends together. It depends on interactions between different social classes, and we have in Brazil. I believe that in America happens more or less the same, but I would say in the last 30 years, when Fordism collapsed, the mode of development collapsed, the old model of development collapsed also a specifically style of how to do politics, for instance. So the old model was more or less clear and visible. I mean, working class organize themselves. They put all together more or less the same basket, or they make their own organizations, political parties, unions, social movements, etc. And on the other hand, you have, in Brazil specifically, you have the federation of the bourgeoisie, organized in institutions, very, very clear. They are clearly identified because you have, the building, the Fiesp building, which gather all the industrial guys in the country, etc. In the state of São Paulo, the most important capitalist state. So the politics is more or less the politics about how to, negotiate the advantage, how to solve strikes, how to, provide some sort of, I would say, advantage for both sides. The redemocratization process in Brazil happens more or less through this way. They were negotiating, fighting. But there was some sort of, clear, I would say, clear benefits on the table. I think in order to make. Nowadays is different because we are living in a very financialized world. The mode of development, the regime of accumulation changed a lot. You cannot identify your enemy because the enemy is spread out, and the world of labor changed. The relations are much more fragmented, and the capitalists, or even the professional, the middle classes, or even the professionals classes, well, they are not organized inside or within specifically companies or enterprise. They are much more spread out. They are working for themselves. So I'm trying to say that the politics is getting more and more confused, and the borders, the frontiers, the borders of who are they, who are us, who is who are fighting for or are fighting against whom. It's really, I mean, collapsing. This clear borders are collapsing, which tends to, I would say, provide a new scenario where the working class, generally speaking, have to not only define their own collective identities, but define their own collective identities, providing sort of front, brother, in order to gather other groups like middle classes, professional. Because in the end of the day, the middle class are getting more and more close to working class than the opposite. So we have to provide new coalitions, new forms of how to organize those interests and how to develop a political agenda that can be able to to make another, or to build up another clear frontier which defines who we are and who they are, and how to fight financial capitalism and stuff.
So Ruy, Bridget Fowler writes that she agrees totally with your argument that abstract labor is at the core of questions about the extraction of surplus value, and that abstract value compels everyone to submit to socially necessary labor time. For example, she notes that for British academics, 4 articles every 4 to 5 years. But she's not sure that abstract value demands differentiation by race and gender. She notes that she thinks we can have Mrs. Moneybags, and equally we can have Black capitalists, and some areas of capitalism that could potentially not have racialized or gender divisions. In other words, racism is contingent and not necessary. E.g., perhaps contemporary China is a non-racist capitalism, she wonders, although the Uyghurs, she stipulates, may be emerging as a racialized group. What would you say to Bridget?
Well, I totally understand the argument. I mean, actually, when you talk about the necessary nexus between racial oppression and capital accumulation, we tend to let me rephrase. We tend to see or to take a look on real relations, like real experience, like China, Japan, etc. I would say two things. For instance, Japan or China. If you go to China and if you analyze the labor relations within China, you're gonna find some sort of, ethnic differentiation among those workers, dividing groups, and the companies are all the time using those ethnic orientation stuff, characteristics in order to take advantage, despite the fact that China is a very specific kind of capitalism, very specific. But even in China, you're going to find groups with, skin characteristics and stuff, which tends to be more exploited than others. In Japan, happened the same. I come from a country, Brazil, who sent a lot of, immigrants to Japan, the Kasegi group of workers, and they are very, very exploited in Japanese capitalism, despite the fact that the labor market in Japan is very, very controlled by the states and stuff. But even so, they are groups of Chinese workers, Brazilian workers, and other workers who are really, really, really exploited in conditions. But if you take into consideration a broader sense, you can see, for instance, when Japan, another time, was very aggressive imperialistic power, they imposed lots of barriers against Koreans, against Chinese in their own lands, exploiting them until the end of the possibility, until the edge of the possibilities, and exerting a very, very supremacist style of power. So what I'm trying to say is that obviously you're going to find examples of, or capitalism which is not that racist, or Marxism, which is more, I would say, civilized, more contemporary, more modern aspect. But in the end of the day, when you extend, when you amplify your thinking historically, in my opinion at least, you're gonna conclude that the theory that put this relation together, capitalism, accumulation, and racial oppression, is right. And this is very, very important connection, a very structural relationship linking those two structures.
So I want to go. It's okay. I want to go back to the discussion about the Chinese thing for just a second, because I think it's all kind of rural-urban division, where people from rural areas who are migrant workers, which reminded me of a question I had about your discussion of colonial era. It's primitive accumulation, it's taking the land, and then it's exploiting labor. But it's not just exploiting. This is where I think your focus strictly on the labor theory of value might lead you to miss Wolpe's best point, which is that you could pay workers less because their peasant families were producing food. It's the same point that Michael drew on for his piece about migrant workers from Mexico. So that I think here, the role of the state in shaping these relationships gets lost, and the state uses race and location partly as a way to organize which workers are going to be most exploited, and then it creates stereotypes. By the way, I think Wolpe was classified a white South African, just to be clear. But his contribution was really that it's the families working peasant labor that subsidizes employers' wages. Because if you need to reproduce the working class, the children have to be fed, and therefore it's actually good for capital to have these peasant communities supporting migrant workers. And I think that also sheds a light on the rebellious youth today, because the youth that you're talking about are not only raised in urban areas, but they are much more educated. They have really different expectations, and they are not going to be peasant workers supporting their families, so they need higher wages, and they're way less likely to be subservient. And I just think that that kind of contextual relationship gets lost with the abstract focus on the labor theory of value.
Well, yeah, no, Gay, I totally agree with you. I mean, we have to. No, we have. I mean, my presentation here was. I obviously, I know it. I assumed the risks. I took the risks. My presentation here was based on the necessity to theorize abstractly this relationship. But in the book, for instance, I quote a lot Michael Voice article about the comparison California and South Africa in order to identify the regime accumulation, the convergence.
The state particularly in that. It's the role of the state is what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, the role of the state.
And reinforcing the differences.
And at that time, Michael was writing a lot about the capitalist state.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the capitalist state play a crucial role. I tried to, in the end of my presentation, talk a little bit about the capitalist state, because the capitalist state is central to organize the regime accumulation. There's no regime accumulation without capitalist state.
Especially primitive accumulation.
Especially primitive accumulation, but this is what produced until today. I mean, when you think about, well, how the regimes of accumulation change throughout the time, throughout the decades and the years and the time, obviously we are all the time identifying situations, contexts, specific situations when the state's apparatus intervene into accumulation in order to reestablish the profitability of the companies. So the regime of accumulation, the change of the regime of accumulation depends on the state, depends on the laws, the regulations, and etc. So I'm totally agree. My goal here was more, I would say, theoretically oriented than historically oriented, but I totally agree with you. I mean, the book that I wrote, it is all about the analysis of 3 cases, I mean, historical cases, despite the fact that there is a theory based, supporting the argument. But anyways, I totally agree with you. I mean, the capitalist state is central.
Fatima, you have the last. Well, we're nearly at time, so we can either take a lightning round. Fatima, you can ask your question. Justin, you can ask your question. Treat, you can ask your question, or we'll just leave it.
We can lightning round so everyone can get in.
Yeah, go for it.
So kind of, on the theoretical level, since that's what you're really proposing, thank you for a wonderful talk. My question is really, for that reason, you're talking about abstract labor and the theory of value. At what level of abstraction are you then proposing that race should enter, right? With abstract labor, you're making this point that doesn't mean that abstract labor is synonymous with being homogenized, right? It's hierarchical and differentiated, and that's part of what produces surplus value and allows for exploitation to happen, right? So my question is, and you've shown how historically through primitive accumulation and also through exploitation, race has been a principal line of division for that to work, to pit people against each other and to allow exploitation to happen. My question is, are you inserting into abstract labor an abstract relationship to race beyond its historical process, or are you falling short of that precisely because, well, the question is, can capitalism exist if we were to dissolve racial division in the future? That's part of what Bacan is concerned with, right? It's conceptualizing more precisely, which is so useful that you've done for us, so we can ask the next question. How precise is it to suppose that it is a part of the concept of abstract labor itself? Or it's an open question to what extent it is a line of division useful to capitalism now or moving forward.
And then my question actually, I think, is very parallel to that, which is race here. I really appreciate the abstract theoretical nature of your conceptualization of race. And race here seems to be serving as like a conceptual aggregation of some kind of more fundamental political economic phenomena, which race is kind of the like in mathematical terms, like the square to the rectangle. Like race is a representation of something that the square is a form specific to, but a general form is some other form of this political economic relationship. So I'm wondering kind of like linking the more historical case examples to this kind of abstract formation. Like you see some of the very same kinds of political economic structures of exploitation and exclusion being wielded in the cases where national formations are the formation of inclusion versus exclusion versus racial formations, like with the Han Chinese or the nation of Singapore or the Arab Emirates and those kinds of formations. So I'm just like curious as to how you're thinking about that too, like the abstraction versus the real abstraction of race.
Thank you, guys. I would say that I try to follow an intellectual agenda which was defined by the Black Marxism. I know that Black Marxists are not is not a homogeneous field, or there are lots of difference among them, etc. But I tend to, that's my opinion, I tend to understand that race is a creation of capital or capitalism, the development of the exploitation and expropriation, which is connected to the capital accumulation. So in my opinion, race is the creation of capitalism. So in this sense, race and the space of race within the capital accumulation, etc., it's in the core of the accumulation process, which means that I don't think that race is connected to abstract labor or concrete labor. I'm saying that race is part of the process of capital accumulation, and the capital accumulation itself depends on the dividing, or and reifying workers groups, which means that sometimes it can appear or it can emerge as ethnic differences, and sometimes as racial divisions. But in both cases, if the ethnic divisions will become racial divisions, depends on a struggle, depends on history, depends on, I don't know, and on the way that capital accumulation evolves throughout the territories, continents, countries, etc. Why? Because abstract, concrete, and socially necessary labor are part of the theory of value. It's not one is more abstract than another one. No, it's just, all of them are part of the same theory. One depends on the other one to exist. So there is no separation. It's part of the process of capital accumulation. In terms of real experience, obviously, as I said, you find like more homogeneous countries, lots of, because countries are political fictions. I mean, the communities, imaginary communities. I mean, it's a basically political fiction. So obviously you're gonna put guys who look like you inside of the same territory and say, well, there's no racial capitalism because there's no racism, there's no racial oppression. But those countries are part of the international, the universal market. It's a part of the capitalism itself. So despite the fact that they are not very, oriented by race at that within
Norway.
Within Norway, Norway is exploiting the racial connections in other countries, other continents, other parts of the globe, because they are part of the same system. So that's my opinion. I mean, it's obvious that racial capitalism, when you are looking in a very specific territory or country, or it's not useful at all, because it's a theory that organizes our minds to criticize the capitalism itself, the whole capitalism, not the national capitalism, or the, you can do this also, but to talk about racial capitalism is another way to talk about capitalism, but in the international scale, invoking international scale.